The morning sun barely touched the horizon when Jake pulled himself out of bed, his joints creaking like old wooden floors. At 62 years old, every movement reminded him of just how tired he'd become. Not the kind of tired that sleep could fix, but the bone-deep exhaustion that comes from carrying grief for too long. He shuffled to the kitchen window and looked out at his ranch. What used to be a thriving cattle operation now looked like a ghost town. Only 12 head of cattle remained in the far pasture, a sad reminder of the hundreds he once owned. The fences needed repair, paint was peeling off the barn, and weeds grew through cracks in the concrete where his prize bulls once stood. Jake made his coffee, the same way he had for 30 years, black, strong, and bitter. Just like his life had become since the accident. He didn't talk about that day much, not even to himself. But every morning when he woke up alone, every evening when silence filled the house, and every time he passed the empty nursery room, the memory hit him like a physical blow. His wife had been 8 months pregnant when it happened. They were driving to the hospital for a routine checkup, talking about baby names and arguing over paint colors for the nursery. She wanted yellow because they didn't know if it was a boy or girl. He wanted to wait and paint it blue or pink after the baby arrived. Such a silly thing to argue about now. The drunk driver ran the red light going 50 in a 30 zone. Jake survived with a broken arm and some cuts. His wife and unborn child didn't make it past the emergency room. That was 30 years ago? But some mornings it felt like yesterday. After the funeral, people kept telling him he was young enough to start over. He was only 32 then. They said he could remarry, have other children, rebuild his life. But Jake couldn't see past the pain. He sold their house in town and bought this remote ranch, miles from the nearest neighbor. He wanted space between himself and the world that had taken everything from him. For the first few years, the ranch kept him busy. Physical work helped numb the emotional pain. He threw himself into building fences, caring for cattle, and expanding the operation. The isolation felt like protection. Out here, nobody asked how he was doing or suggested he should move on with his life, but time has a way of wearing everything down, including grief. The sharp edge of his pain had dulled into a constant ache. The ranch that once distracted him now felt like a burden. His body couldn't handle the work like it used to, and his heart wasn't in it anymore. Last month, the bank had sent the final notice. 30 days to pay what he owed or lose everything. The number on the paper was bigger than anything he could manage. Even if he sold every cow, every piece of equipment, and everything else he owned, it wouldn't be enough. Jake had spent the last week going through old photo albums and papers, trying to decide what was worth keeping. Most of it would probably end up in the trash anyway. Who would want pictures of a life that never fully happened? Who would care about the dreams of a man who gave up dreaming decades ago? This morning felt different, though. As he sat at his kitchen table with his coffee, looking at that bank notice one more time, something settled in his chest. A kind of peace he hadn't felt in years. He'd made his decision. He walked to the hall closet and pulled out his old army shovel, the one he'd kept from his service days. The metal was still solid, the handle worn smooth from years of use. It felt right in his hands, familiar and dependable. Behind the house, past the vegetable garden that had grown wild with weeds, stood an old oak tree. It had been there when he bought the place, probably 100 years old or more. Its thick trunk and spreading branches had sheltered his dog during hot summer days. When Rex died 5 years ago, Jake had buried him under that tree. It seemed like a peaceful spot. The ground was softer than he expected. All the rain they'd had this spring made the digging easier. Jake worked slowly, taking breaks when his back started complaining. He wasn't in any hurry. Time had become meaningless anyway. As he dug, memories floated through his mind like clouds. He remembered teaching his wife to ride his old mare. She'd been terrified at first, gripping the saddle so tight her knuckles went white. But by the end of that summer, she was racing him across the back pasture, laughing when her horse beat his to the fence line. He thought about the baby room they'd started preparing. They'd only gotten as far as buying a crib and a rocking chair. After the accident, he'd locked that room and never opened it again. The crib was probably still there, covered in dust, waiting for a child who would never come. The hole was getting deeper now. Deep enough that Jake had to step down into it to keep digging. The walls were straight and even. He'd always been good with his hands, careful and precise. Even now, at the end, he wanted to do this right. As the afternoon wore on, Jake's movements became more mechanical. Scoop, lift, toss, scoop, lift, toss. The rhythm was almost meditative. This was probably the most peaceful he'd felt in years. There was something comforting about having a plan, about knowing that soon all the pain and loneliness would be over. He climbed out of the hole and looked at his work. It was about 6 feet long, 3 feet wide, and 4 feet deep. Deep enough. He'd learned in the army that you didn't need to go the full 6 feet like in the movies. 4 feet would do just fine. Jake gathered his tools and headed back to the house. He had some things to take care of first. He wanted to write a letter explaining his decision, maybe leave instructions for whoever found him. He owed that much to the world. In the kitchen, he opened a beer and sat down at the table with a piece of paper. Writing had never been his strong suit, but he tried to find the right words. He wanted people to understand that this wasn't about anger or desperation. It was about being tired. Tired of waking up every day to an empty house. Tired of going through motions without purpose. Tired of missing people who had been gone longer than he'd known them. As the sun started setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Jake finished his letter. He folded it carefully and left it on the kitchen counter where someone would find it. Then he walked back outside, breathing in the cool evening air. The oak tree looked different in the fading light. More majestic somehow, like an ancient guardian watching over the land. Jake stood beside the hole he'd dug, feeling a strange mix of sadness and relief. Tomorrow, he decided. Tomorrow he would finish what he'd started, but as he turned ahead, back to the house, he heard something that stopped him cold. The sound of a car engine, sputtering and struggling, coming up his long driveway. In 30 years of living out here, unexpected visitors were rare. Jake frowned and walked toward the front of his property, wondering who could be coming to see him at this hour. The sound was getting closer, and with it came the realization that his careful plans might have to wait. Someone was about to need his help, and despite everything he was going through, Jake couldn't ignore that call. The old sedan wheezed and coughed as it struggled up Jake's gravel driveway. Even from a distance he could tell the car was on its last legs. Steam was rising from under the hood, and the engine made sounds that no engine should make. Whoever was driving was pushing that vehicle way past its limits. Jake stood by his front gate, squinting in the fading light. The car finally gave up about 50 yards from his property line, rolling to a stop with one final mechanical groan. For a moment, nothing happened. The evening air was so quiet he could hear crickets starting their nightly songs. Then the driver's door creaked open. A young woman stepped out, and even in the dim light, Jake could see she was in trouble. She moved slowly, carefully, one hand pressed against her lower back. Her other hand rested on what was clearly a very pregnant belly. She couldn't have been more than 25, with long dark hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, and clothes that looked like she'd been wearing them for days. She took a few steps toward his gate, then stopped and looked around like she wasn't sure where she was. Jake could see her swaying slightly, the way people do when they're exhausted or in pain. Maybe both. The young woman tried to take another step, but her legs seemed to give out. She crumpled to the gravel road like a marionette, with cut strings, landing hard on her knees before toppling sideways. Jake felt something inside his chest that he hadn't felt in years. It was like an old engine turning over after sitting unused for decades. Without thinking, he was moving, his legs carrying him toward the gate faster than they had in months. His mind was racing as he fumbled with the gate latch. What was a pregnant woman doing way out here? The nearest town was 30 miles away, and his ranch was at the end of a dead-end road. Nobody just happened to drive out here by accident. He reached her just as she was trying to sit up. Up close, he could see she was younger than he'd first thought, maybe early 20s. Her face was pale and streaked with tears, and her clothes were wrinkled like she'd been sleeping in her car. "Hey there," Jake said softly, kneeling beside her on the gravel. "Easy now. Don't try to get up just yet." She looked at him with wide, frightened eyes. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "I didn't mean to. My car just died and I didn't know where else to go." Jake could see she was shaking, though the evening wasn't particularly cold. He'd seen that kind of shaking before, back in his army days. It was the kind that came from shock and exhaustion, when your body had been running on adrenaline for too long. "What's your name?" he asked, keeping his voice gentle. "Lily," she said, then immediately looked like she regretted telling him. I just need to use a phone, if you have one. My cell died hours ago." Jake noticed she kept glancing back toward the road like she was expecting someone to follow her. Everything about her body language screamed fear. She was running from something or someone. "How far along are you?" he asked, nodding toward her belly. 8 months, she said, wrapping her arms protectively around herself. "The baby's not due for another month, but—" She winced and pressed her hand to her side. "Are you having contractions?" She shook her head quickly. No, just tired, really tired. I've been driving since yesterday morning." That explained a lot. Jake had never been around pregnant women much, but he knew enough to understand that being 8 months pregnant and driving for over 24 hours was a recipe for trouble. "Look," he said, standing up and offering her his hand. "Let's get you inside. You need to sit down properly, get some water, maybe something to eat. Then we can figure out what to do about your car." Lily hesitated, looking up at him with those scared eyes. "I don't want to cause any trouble. If you could just let me use your phone, The phone's inside," Jake said. "And even if it wasn't, you're in no shape to be standing out here in the road. Come on." She let him help her to her feet, though she moved like every muscle in her body ached. As they walked slowly toward his house, Jake got a better look at her car. It was an old Honda, probably 15 years old at least, with mismatched tires, and a rear bumper held on with duct tape. The trunk was stuffed so full of belongings that it wouldn't close properly. Everything she owned was probably in that car. "You running from someone?" he asked as they reached his front porch. Lily stopped walking and stared at him. "What makes you say that?" "Pregnant woman, driving alone for 24 hours with everything she owns packed in her car, ending up on a back road in the middle of nowhere?" Jake shrugged. "Either you're running from something or you're lost in a really spectacular way." For a moment, he thought she might bolt. Her whole body tensed like she was ready to run, even though she could barely walk. Then her shoulders sagged and she looked so tired that Jake felt something twist in his chest. "My boyfriend," she said quietly. "Ex-boyfriend now, I guess. He wasn't happy about the baby. Said if I wasn't going to take care of it, then I could take care of it somewhere else." Jake felt his jaw tighten. He'd never had much patience for men who abandoned pregnant women, and even less for ones who kicked them out. "He hurt you?" Jake asked. Lily's hand went instinctively to her cheek, and Jake noticed a fading bruise near her hairline that he'd missed in the dim light. Not, she said. But he was getting angrier, and when he started drinking, She trailed off and shook her head. "I couldn't stay. Not with the baby coming." They reached his front door, and Jake paused with his hand on the handle. 30 years ago, he would have opened this door without a second thought. His wife would have already been fussing over this girl, making tea and preparing the guest room. But 30 years of isolation had made him cautious about letting people into his space. Still, looking at Lily swaying on her feet, her hand pressed protectively over her unborn child, Jake knew he couldn't turn her away. Some things mattered more than his comfort zone. "The phone's in the kitchen," he said, opening the door. "And there's a couch where you can rest while you make your calls." The house felt different with someone else in it. Jake hadn't realized how quiet it usually was until he heard the sound of another person's footsteps on his floors. Lily looked around the living room like she was memorizing escape routes, but she sank onto his old couch with obvious relief. "Thank you," she said, and for the first time since he'd seen her, she almost smiled. I know this is weird, a stranger showing up at your door like this. Jake was already moving toward the kitchen to get her some water. I've seen stranger things, he said, though honestly, he wasn't sure he had died as he filled a glass at the sink. He caught sight of the letter he'd written earlier still sitting on the counter where he'd left it. His plans for tomorrow seemed like they belonged to someone else now. How could he think about ending his life when someone else's was just beginning, and she needed his help to protect it? He grabbed the letter and stuffed it in his pocket, then carried the water back to Lily. Whatever he'd been planning could wait. Right now, someone needed him, and that changed everything. Lily sat on Jake's couch, holding the glass of water with both hands like it was something precious. She took small sips, and Jake could see some color returning to her pale cheeks. The living room felt strange with another person in it. After 30 years of silence, even the sound of someone else breathing seemed loud. So, Jake said, settling into his old recliner across from her. Who were you planning to call? Lily's face fell. That's the problem. I don't really have anyone. My parents, they weren't happy when they found out about the baby. Saad, I was throwing my life away. She stared down at her belly. My sister lives in California, but we haven't talked in 2 years. I have her number, but I don't even know if it still works. Jake watched her struggle with the reality of her situation. She was alone, pregnant, and broke down in the middle of nowhere with a man she'd just met. It should have been terrifying, but something about her seemed strong despite everything she was going through. What about the baby's father? He asked. I told you he didn't want ... Quote, Lily stopped and shook her head. His name is Derek. We were together for 3 years. I thought he loved me. But when I told him I was pregnant, everything changed. He started saying I did it on purpose to trap him, that I should get rid of it. When I said no, he got mean. She touched her cheek again, where that fading bruise lingered. At first it was just yelling, then he started throwing things. Last week he shoved me so hard I fell and hit the coffee table. That's when I knew I had to leave. Jake felt his hands clench into fists. He'd never been a violent man, but something about pregnant women and children brought out protective instincts he didn't know he still had. You did the right thing, he said. Leaving? I mean, did I? Lily's voice cracked. I have $300 to my name, a car that just died and nowhere to go. How's that the right thing? Jake was quiet for a moment. 30 years ago, he would have had answers. His wife would have known exactly what to say to comfort someone in this situation. But he'd spent so long avoiding people that he'd forgotten how to help them. You want to try calling your sister? He asked finally. Lily nodded, though she didn't look hopeful. Jake showed her to the kitchen phone, an old rotary model that still hung on the wall. He'd never seen any reason to replace it since it worked fine. He tried to give her privacy, but the house was small and voices carried. He could hear her giggling, then a long pause. Hello? Amy? It's me, Lily. Yes, I know it's been a long time. Listen, I'm in trouble and I need ... Her voice got smaller. I know we had a fight, but please just listen for a minute. Jake heard the dial tone from across the room. Even from where he sat, he could see Lily's shoulders shaking. She hung up the phone and stood there for a moment, one hand pressed against the wall like she needed it to hold her up. She hung up on you? Jake asked softly. Lily came back to the living room, wiping her eyes. She said I made my bed and now I have to lie in it, just like Mom and Dad. She sank back onto the couch. I guess I really am on my own. The silence stretched between them. Jake found himself thinking about the letter in his pocket, the hole he dug behind the oak tree. This morning, ending his life had seemed like the logical solution to his problems. But looking at Lily now, he realized his problems were nothing compared to what she was facing. You can stay here tonight, he heard himself say. Lily looked up sharply. What? You can stay here tonight, Jake repeated, surprising himself. You're exhausted, it's getting dark, and your car's not going anywhere. The spare room has a bed. It's not much, but it's clean. I can't ask you to do that. You don't even know me. You're not asking, I'm offering. Jake stood up and walked to the window. Outside, the last light was fading from the sky. Look, I've been living alone out here for 30 years. One night with a house guest isn't going to kill me. The irony of that statement wasn't lost on him. This morning he'd been planning to kill himself. Now he was worried about the inconvenience of having company. Why? Lily asked. Why would you help a stranger? Jake turned back to look at her. She was so young and so scared and so determined to protect the baby she was carrying. It reminded him of something he'd lost long ago. My wife was pregnant once, he said quietly. We lost the baby, lost her too. If someone had been there to help when she needed it, double quotes, he trailed off and shrugged. Maybe things would have been different. Lily's eyes filled with tears again, but these seemed different, softer. I'm sorry for your loss. It was a long time ago. Jake cleared his throat. The spare room is down the hall, second door on the right. There are clean sheets on the bed and towels in the closet if you want to shower. I don't have any clean clothes, Lily said. Everything I own is in my car, and it's probably a mess. By now, Jake thought for a moment, I might have something that would work. My wife's things are still in the closet. She was smaller than you, but he gestured toward her belly. Maybe something loose would fit. The offer surprised him. He hadn't opened that closet in 30 years, hadn't touched her clothes or looked at her things. But somehow the idea of her clothes helping someone else, helping a pregnant woman who needed them, felt right. Are you sure? Lily asked. That seems like something very personal. She would have wanted to help, Jake said, and he knew it was true. She always said clothes were meant to be worn, not stored away gathering dust. That night, Jake made dinner for 2 people for the first time in 3 decades. Just canned soup and grilled cheese sandwiches, but it felt strange to set 2 places at the table. Lily had showered and changed into one of his wife's old nightgowns, a soft blue cotton dress that actually fit her pretty well. This is really good, she said, though Jake knew it wasn't anything special. It's just soup, he said. It's the first hot meal I've had in 3 days. Lily smiled, and Jake realized it was the first time he'd seen her really smile since she'd arrived. And the first time someone's been kind to me in a long time. They ate in comfortable silence for a while. Jake found himself stealing glances at her, watching the way she unconsciously rubbed her belly while she ate. The baby was moving around in there, and sometimes her whole stomach would shift and roll in ways that looked both amazing and uncomfortable. When's the last time you saw a doctor? He asked. About a month ago. Everything was fine then. The baby's healthy, growing normally. I was supposed to go back next week, but she gestured vaguely at everything that had happened. There's a clinic in town, small place, but the doctor's good. Been there for 20 years. I can't afford a doctor visit right now. We'll figure something out, Jake said, then stopped. We? When had he started thinking in terms of we? After dinner, Lily helped him clean up despite his protests that she should rest. She moved carefully like everything hurt, but she insisted on doing her part. Thank you, she said as they finished, for everything. For letting me stay, for dinner, for treating me like a person instead of a problem. Jake nodded, not trusting himself to speak. As she headed toward the spare room, he sat alone in his kitchen, looking at the spot where his letter had been that morning. Outside, the oak tree stood silent in the darkness, the hole he'd dug hidden in its shadow, for the first time in years. Jake wasn't thinking about the past. He was thinking about tomorrow. Jake woke up at 3 a.m. to the sound of someone moving around the house. For a moment, he couldn't remember why that was strange. Then it hit him, Lily. He'd almost forgotten he wasn't alone anymore. He lay in bed listening to footsteps. In the hallway, then the sound of the kitchen faucet running. She was probably just getting water. Pregnant women needed lots of water. He remembered reading that somewhere. But then he heard a sharp intake of breath, followed by what sounded like someone trying very hard not to cry out. Jake was out of bed and pulling on his robe before he'd fully decided to get up. He found Lily in the kitchen, leaning against the counter with both hands pressed to her belly. Her face was pale and tight with pain. What's wrong? He asked, keeping his voice low. I think something's happening, she whispered. "The baby's been moving around all night, and now I'm getting these pains." As if on cue, her whole body tensed, and she gripped the counter so hard her knuckles went white. Jake could see her trying to breathe through whatever was happening. "How long have you been having pains?" he asked. "Maybe an hour?" "They weren't too bad at first, but they're getting stronger." Another wave hit her, and she doubled over slightly. "This isn't supposed to happen yet. The baby's not due for another month." Jake's mind raced. The nearest hospital was 45 minutes away on a good day. In the middle of the night, with these back roads, it could take even longer. And that was assuming her car was working, which it wasn't. "We need to get you to a hospital," he said. "How?" "My car won't start, and I don't have money for an ambulance even if they'd come out here." "My truck," Jake said. "It's old, but it runs." They were interrupted by another contraction, this one strong enough that Lily had to grab onto Jake's arm to keep from falling. When it passed, she looked up at him with frightened eyes. "What if we don't make it in time?" It was a question Jake didn't want to think about, but he'd lived on a ranch long enough to know that babies, human or animal, sometimes came when they wanted to, not when it was convenient. "Let's get you dressed first," he said. "Then we'll see how much time we have between contractions." But as Lily tried to walk back to the spare room, another pain hit her before she'd gone 10 steps. This one was different, stronger and longer than the others. When it ended, she looked at Jake with panic in her eyes. "They're getting closer together," she said. "I don't think we're going to make it to the hospital." Jake felt a familiar calm settle over him, the same feeling he'd had during emergencies. In the Army, when things went wrong, you didn't panic. You dealt with whatever was in front of you and figured out the rest as you went. "Okay," he said. "Let's think about this. How many babies have been born without doctors? Millions, right? Women have been doing this for thousands of years." "But I don't know what I'm doing," Lily said, fear making her voice shake. "What if something goes wrong? Then we'll figure it out." Jake surprised himself with how steady he sounded. "I've helped deliver calves when the vet couldn't make it out. I know it's not the same thing, but some of the basics are probably similar." Another contraction hit, and this time Jake timed it. 45 seconds long, and when it ended, Lily was breathing hard. "We need to get you somewhere more comfortable," he said. "The spare room has that big bed, and it's closer to the bathroom." They made it to the spare room just as another contraction started. Jake had never felt so helpless in his life. He'd faced enemy fire, watched friends die, buried his wife and unborn child, but nothing had prepared him for this. "What do we need?" he asked when Lily could speak again. "Clean towels," she said, her voice strained, "lots of them. And we need to sterilize something to cut the cord with. Scissors, maybe? And string to tie it off." Jake nodded and went to gather supplies. His hands were shaking as he pulled towels from the linen closet and found his sharpest scissors. He remembered reading somewhere that you could sterilize things by boiling them, so he put a pot of water on the stove. When he got back to the room, Lily was sitting on the edge of the bed, rocking back and forth. "The contractions are coming." "Every few minutes now," she said. "And I feel like I need to push." Jake felt his heart rate spike. "Are you sure?" "I'm sure." Lily looked at him with a mixture of fear and determination. "This baby's coming whether we're ready or not." The next few hours passed in a blur. Jake found himself doing things he never imagined he'd do, coaching Lily through contractions, helping her find comfortable positions, running back and forth for supplies. He delivered plenty of calves over the years, but this was different. This was a person, a tiny human being who was about to enter the world in his spare bedroom. "I can see the head," Jake said, his voice full of wonder. And he could, a tiny crown of dark hair visible with each contraction. "Really?" Lily gasped between pushes. "Is the baby okay?" "Looks perfect to me," Jake said, though he honestly had no idea what to look for. The baby's head was out now, and Jake gently supported it with his hands. One more big push should do it. Lily bore down with everything she had, and suddenly Jake was holding a slippery, squirming baby. The infant was smaller than he'd expected and covered in blood and fluid, but she was moving and making soft mewing sounds. "It's a girl, Jake." sighed, his voice cracking with emotion. "You have a daughter." He cleaned the baby as best he could with the towels, then used the sterilized scissors to cut the cord where Lily told him to. The whole process felt surreal, like he was watching someone else do it. "Is she breathing okay?" Lily asked, reaching for her daughter. Jake placed the baby on Lily's chest, and immediately the infant's cries got stronger. The sound filled the room, the sound of new life, of hope, of a future that was just beginning. "She's perfect," Jake said, and he meant it. The baby was tiny but seemed healthy, with a full head of dark hair and lungs that worked just fine. Lily was crying and laughing at the same time, holding her daughter close. "Hi, baby girl," she whispered. "I'm your mama. We made it." Jake sat back in the chair beside the bed, suddenly exhausted. He looked at Lily holding her newborn daughter, both of them alive and healthy despite everything that could have gone wrong, and felt something shift inside his chest. 12 hours ago, he'd been digging his own grave. Now he'd help bring new life into the world. The irony wasn't lost on him. "Thank you," Lily said, looking up at him with tears in her eyes. "I couldn't have done this without you." Jake nodded, not trusting himself to speak. Outside, dawn was breaking over the ranch, painting the sky in soft pinks and golds. It was going to be a beautiful day. "What are you going to name her?" he asked. Lily looked down at her daughter, who had settled into a peaceful sleep. "Hope," she said. "Her name is Hope." 6 months later, Jake stood in the same spot where he'd once planned to end his life. But instead of looking at a grave, he watched Lily teach baby Hope to pet one of the gentle horses. The little girl was sitting up now, giggling every time the horse's soft nose touched her tiny hands. "She's going to be fearless around animals," Lily said, settling Hope more securely on her lap. "Just like her grandpa Jake?" The word grandpa still caught Jake off guard every time Lily used it. She'd started calling him that when Hope was about 3 months old, and somehow it had stuck. At first, he'd protested that he wasn't old enough to be anyone's grandfather, but Lily had just smiled and said that age had nothing to do with it. "Look at her," Lily continued, as Hope reached out to grab a handful of the horse's mane. 6 months old and already trying to ride? Jake chuckled, gently loosening Hope's grip before she could yank too hard. "Let's wait until she can walk before we put her on horseback." The ranch looked completely different now. The fences were repaired, the barn had a fresh coat of paint, and new vegetable gardens stretched out behind the house. What had once been a dying operation was now thriving. Again, it hadn't happened overnight. Those first few weeks after Hope was born had been challenging. Lily was recovering from childbirth. Hope needed feeding every few hours, and Jake was learning how to live with other people again after 30 years alone, but somehow they'd made it work. The turning point had come when Lily suggested they start growing vegetables to sell at the farmer's market in town. Jake had been skeptical at first. He was a cattle rancher, not a gardener. But Lily had a green thumb that amazed him, and she understood things about soil and plants that he'd never learned. Their first market day had been a disaster. They'd shown up with 3 boxes of tomatoes and some wilted lettuce, and Jake had felt foolish standing there while other vendors displayed beautiful arrangements of produce. But an elderly woman had bought their entire stock of tomatoes, saying they were the best she'd tasted in years. "It's because we grow them with love," Lily had said later, counting their modest earnings. "That makes all the difference." Jake had thought she was being sentimental, but over the following months, he'd started to understand what she meant. When you cared about something, when you had a reason to make it succeed, everything changed. Now, 6 months later, they were one of the most popular vendors at the market. People came specifically for their tomatoes, their sweet corn, and Lily's homemade preserves. Jake had even started raising chickens again, something he hadn't done since his wife died. "Remember when you said you didn't know anything about vegetables?" Lily teased, watching Jake check on the latest crop of beans. "I still don't," Jake said. "You're the one with all the knowledge. I just dig holes and carry heavy things. You do a lot more than that." Lily shifted Hope to her other arm. "You saved our lives, Jake. Both of ours." Jake was quiet for a moment. They'd had this conversation before, and he never knew what to say. The truth was, Lily and Hope had saved his life just as much as he'd saved theirs. That first month had been the hardest. Hope cried at all hours, Lily was exhausted from breastfeeding and recovery, and Jake felt overwhelmed by the responsibility of caring for both of them. There were nights when he'd sit in his kitchen at 3 a.m, listening to the baby cry and wonder what he'd gotten himself into, but there were other moments too. The first time Hope had smiled at him. The morning he'd found Lily singing lullabies while she worked in the garden. The day Hope had taken her first steps, stumbling across the living room straight into his arms. Those moments had reminded him what it felt like to be part of a family. "I found something in your desk last week," Lily said quietly, interrupting his thoughts, "when I was looking for stamps." Jake's stomach dropped. He'd forgotten about the letter he'd written that first night, the one he'd shoved in a drawer and never thrown away. "I'm sorry," Lily continued. "I wasn't snooping. I just needed stamps for the seed catalog orders, and I saw—" She trailed off, looking down at Hope. "Were you really going to do that, end your life?" Jake had dreaded this conversation for months, but now that it was happening, he felt a strange sense of relief. "I was," he said simply. "I dug the hole and everything, behind the oak tree where my dog is buried." Lily was quiet for a long moment. "What changed your mind?" "You did?" Jake looked at her holding Hope, both of them healthy and happy in the afternoon sunshine. "You and this little one? You gave me something to live for again." "We gave each other something to live for," Lily said. "I was just as lost as you were, Jake. Maybe more lost. At least you had a home." That was true. When Lily had shown up at his gate, she'd had nothing but the clothes on her back and a broken-down car. Now she had a partner in the farm business, a safe place to raise her daughter, and something Jake had never expected to give again, a family. The legal arrangements had been complicated. Jake had formally adopted Hope, making him her legal guardian alongside Lily. He'd also added Lily as a co-owner of the ranch, something that had required more paperwork than he'd expected, but felt absolutely right. "The lawyer called yesterday," Jake said, remembering the phone conversation. "The adoption papers are final. Hope is officially my granddaughter now." Lily smiled. "She always was, Jake. The papers just make it official." As if she understood they were talking about her, Hope looked up at Jake and reached out her chubby arms. He took her from Lily, marveling as he always did at how light she was, how perfectly she fit against his chest. "Hey there, little one," he murmured, and Hope responded with a string of babbled sounds that almost sounded like words. "She's trying to say Grandpa," Lily said. "Listen to her." Gaga, Jake listened, and sure enough, the sounds did seem purposeful. "You think she knows what she's saying?" "I think she knows exactly who you are," Lily said. "You're the man who helped bring her into the world. The man who's kept us safe and loved. Of course she knows who you are." As the sun began to set, they walked back toward the house. The vegetable garden was flourishing, the chickens were settling in for the night, and smoke was rising from the chimney where Jake had started a fire earlier. It looked like a home. It felt like a home. That night, after Hope was asleep and Lily was working on her preserves, Jake walked out to the oak tree. The spot where he'd dug that hole was now covered in wildflowers that Lily had planted. She'd never asked him about the disturbed earth, but somehow she'd known what it meant. The flowers were beautiful in the moonlight, bright yellows and purples that seemed to glow against the dark ground. Jake knelt and touched the petals, thinking about the man who had dug that hole 6 months ago. That man had been convinced his life was over, that he had nothing left to offer the world. How wrong he'd been. From the house, he could hear Hope's soft laughter and Lily's voice singing. The sounds of life, of love, of a future worth living. Jake stood up and walked back toward those sounds, toward the family he'd never expected to have and couldn't imagine living without. Behind him, the wildflowers swayed in the evening breeze, marking not an ending, but a beginning.